Tonight the air carries a weight that feels older than the land itself. The wind moves slow across the tall grasses of the colonial fields, brushing over the broken stalks left after the harvest, stirring the scent of soil and wood smoke into the night. The lanterns burn low along the dirt road, their dim glow bending against the chill, marking a path that leads from the edge of the village toward the thick stand of forest beyond. It is late October in the New World, a time when the nights stretch long and the people whisper that the dead remember the living. They call it All Hallows Eve, though some still name it by the older words of their ancestors, words brought across the sea from forgotten villages, where belief was not spoken, but lived. The year might be 1692 or 1730. It hardly matters. The world outside the walls is dark, untamed, filled with the sound of branches shifting against each other like slow, restless voices. The people inside their wooden homes feel that darkness press close, patient and listening. The walls are thin, made of pine boards that creak when the wind leans hard, and every sound beyond them carries easily into the stillness. A shutter rattles, a door settles, and for a moment even the fire hesitates to move. These are the hours when superstition becomes a kind of language, a quiet agreement between generations that something unseen waits beyond the reach of the firelight. If you are listening from the cities, from faraway shores, or in the quiet of your own evening, make yourself comfortable. Let the hum of the world around you fade. The story you are about to hear belongs to a time before electricity, before engines and noise, when night itself was an event. The people of the colonies measured their lives by the hours of daylight and the strength of their candles. And when those candles burned down to stubs, they turned instead to faith, charms, and the old ways whispered by grandmothers, who still remembered what it meant to live in a world where every creak of the floor or whisper of the wind might mean more than chance. The fields are quiet now. The last of the corn stands dry and brittle, its leaves rattling faintly in the breeze. The ground is uneven, scattered with stones that have been pulled from the soil year after year, reminders of how difficult this new world has always been. Beyond the edge of the fields lies the forest, dense and endless, a place the colonists approach with reverence and unease. To them, it is not simply land, but a presence. They know its sounds, the soft cry of an owl, the snapping of a branch, but they do not always trust that every noise belongs to an animal. The older settlers say the woods keep memory, that the trees remember what was buried beneath them long before the first house was built. They do not wander there after dusk, not on this night. In one small settlement near the coast, a faint line of light spills from the windows of a timber house. Smoke rises thinly from the chimney, curling upward into the starlit air. Inside, the hearth glows with a steady flame, and the scent of burning oak fills the single room. A man sits near the fire, his hands rough from the season's work, carving at a block of wood. The shape is simple, meant to hold a stub of candle later in the night. His wife moves quietly behind him, her skirts whispering over the floorboards as she tends to a pot hung above the flames. The air carries the smell of broth and herbs, faintly sweet, faintly sharp. At the small table near the wall, two children sit close together, whispering in low tones while they peel apples by the dim light of a tallow candle. The apples are not for eating. The older child, a girl no more than 12, drops each curling strip of peel onto the floor, watching how it falls. Her grandmother, seated in the corner beside the spinning wheel, told her that if the peel lands in the shape of a letter, it will reveal the first initial of the person she will marry. The girl knows it is foolish, but she watches closely all the same. When the peel drops into a rough curve that almost resembles a letter, her brother laughs quietly, his voice just above a whisper, and their grandmother looks up from her work with a soft, knowing smile. These are the small amusements allowed on a night when laughter itself must be careful, when even the sound of joy can draw attention from the wrong places. The old woman's voice is low, and even as she speaks, she tells them that in her youth, in a village across the sea, the people used to light candles at crossroads to guide wandering souls. They believed the dead could lose their way after passing, and it was kindness to give them a light. Here, she says, the forest and the fields have taken that role. The stars are the only guides, and even they are not always clear when the wind turns cold. The children listen, half curious, half uneasy. Outside, a dog barks once, sharp and distant, and then nothing more. The man looks toward the door. It is latched, as it always is after sundown. Beside it hangs a small iron horseshoe, fixed there not for decoration, but protection. Every home in the settlement has one, a habit brought from the old country. Iron, they say, offends restless spirits. It is the same reason the men drive iron nails into their door frames and place iron knives beside their beds. The minister calls such things foolish relics, unchristian remnants of heathen thought. Yet when his own barn caught fire last spring, he nailed an iron cross over the lintel just the same. The wife finishes stirring the pot and moves to the table, placing a bowl of bread near the children. The bread is plain, made from coarse meal, but it carries its own kind of comfort. She places a smaller piece on a plate near the hearth, not for any of them, but for what might pass by unseen. It is an offering, simple and unspoken. She does not look at it again. The grandmother nods approvingly, her hands never stopping their slow work with the spindle. The man pretends not to notice, though he has done the same every year since he built the house. Outside, the air has grown colder. Frost gathers along the edges of the fields, silvering the grass and the fence posts. The sound of the wind changes as it moves through the trees, less a whisper now, more a steady hum that seems to rise and fall in time with the flicker of the fire inside. Somewhere far off, the faint toll of a church bell carries across the valley. The settlers hear it and count without speaking. 8, 9, 10. The hours slip away. The grandmother stops spinning, her gaze lifting toward the shuttered window. The veil thins after 11, she murmurs, half to herself. Best keep the fire strong. The man adds another log to the hearth. Sparks rise and curl, drifting upward into the smoke-blackened chimney. The light deepens, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. The shadows stretch and sway across the walls, taking on shapes that almost move on their own. The children watch them, each shape alive in imagination, some friendly, some less so. The old woman tells them not to stare too long. The fire's glow, she says, is a mirror to the world beyond. If one looks too deeply, one might see more than reflection. The boy asks if the dead truly walk tonight. His grandmother's eyes narrow slightly, her fingers pausing on the thread. They walk where they are remembered, she answers, and where they are not feared. The girl shivers, pulling her shawl closer, though the warmth of the hearth fills the room. Outside, the trees groan under the weight of the wind. It is not a storm, not yet, but the kind of restless stirring that makes the forest sound alive. The man listens without lifting his head. He has heard it every autumn, but tonight it seems nearer, heavier. In the small space between the window shutters, a thread of cold air seeps through, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant smoke. The wife notices and stuffs a scrap of linen into the crack, murmuring softly under her breath. She does not speak the words clearly, but they are not a prayer. They are older, the kind of words she learned before she knew letters, a habit her mother taught her to keep misfortune outside. The grandmother's eyes flicker toward her briefly, acknowledging the act without comment. These small gestures are not discussed, yet everyone in the room knows their purpose. A lantern hangs near the door, its wick trimmed low, its light just enough to mark the entrance. The flame wavers, then steadies again. For a moment, the man looks up from his carving. His gaze lingers there on the faint glow shifting behind the glass. It might be the draught, or it might be nothing at all. He waits a heartbeat longer before returning to his work. The knife moves slow, each stroke releasing the faint, clean scent of fresh-cut pine. The sound of the blade against wood blends with the gentle hum of the spinning wheel, the soft bubbling of the pot, the crackle of the fire. It is the sound of an ordinary night, made extraordinary only by what each of them feels pressing at the edges of thought. Beyond the walls, the night deepens. The moon, hidden behind thin clouds, sheds a pale, uncertain light over the settlement. The houses stand in still lines along the dirt road, their chimneys smoking faintly, their windows shuttered tight. A few dogs bark, then fall silent. The air feels heavy, expectant. Somewhere in the forest, a branch breaks with a sharp, hollow crack. The sound echoes once, then fades. Inside the homes, people sit closer to their fires, pretending not to have heard. In the little house by the field, the grandmother's voice breaks the quiet. She begins a story, one the children have heard before, but never mind hearing again. She tells of the year when the frost came early, before the harvest was finished, and how one farmer left his crops standing in the field, promising to return after the thaw. But when spring came, he found the stalks still standing, untouched by snow or wind, and the sound of whispering carried through them whenever he passed. Some say it was the spirits of those who died hungry that winter. Others said it was the land itself, angry to have been forgotten. No one planted there again. The girl listens, her eyes wide, her hands still. The boy tries to laugh, but the sound falters halfway. The man glances toward the window again. The lantern flickers once more. A faint sound, almost like a footstep, moves across the porch outside. He waits, listening. The sound does not return. The wind shifts, carrying with it the faint creak of the sign that hangs above the nearby meeting house. The night resumes its rhythm, though the silence afterward feels slightly heavier than before. The grandmother resumes spinning. The thread stretches between her fingers, glinting in the firelight. The dead knock softly, she says without looking up. But not to frighten, only to be remembered. The wife looks toward her, but says nothing. The man sets his carving down and stirs the fire again, the iron poker clanging softly against the stone hearth. The children huddle closer, listening to the small chorus of sounds that have become the voice of the night itself. Time moves differently now. The hours seem to slow, marked not by the clock, but by the dimming of the candles and the deepening of the shadows. The air feels thicker, as though holding its breath. Somewhere outside, another door closes, the wooden echo carrying faintly through the stillness. Perhaps a neighbour, perhaps not. The grandmother hums a tune that the wife half remembers from her own childhood, a song once sung to quiet, restless spirits at the edge of the village. The melody winds softly through the room, blending with the crackle of the fire until it becomes part of the air itself. The boy finally lies down on the small rug near the hearth, his eyes half closed, though he does not yet sleep. The girl leans against her mother, watching the fire. Each flicker seems to shift the shapes of the shadows around the room. For a moment, she thinks she sees movement near the door, but when she blinks, it is gone. The grandmother's spindle turns slowly, the soft whirring sound marking the passing minutes. The man sits silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. The wife adjusts the shawl around her shoulders, feeling the warmth of the room against the chill that seeps from the floor. Outside, the forest moves again. The wind drifts low through the trees, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. The lantern by the road swings gently, its dim light swaying like a pendulum. In the stillness between gusts, the world seems to hold its breath once more, balanced between one heartbeat and the next. The people inside their homes do not know what time it is now, only that the night has settled fully, and the thin line between the living and the dead has grown faint enough that even the smallest sound feels like a message. The fire snaps, a single loud pop that startles the silence. A spark leaps upward, bright for an instant before fading into the chimney's dark. The boy stirs, the grandmother's spinning wheel slows, and the wife's humming ceases for a moment. Then, as if by silent agreement, everything resumes again. The rhythm of the house returns. But outside, beyond the thin wooden walls, the forest listens still. And as the last of the apples are peeled and the candles burn lower, the night continues its patient watch, neither kind nor cruel, simply waiting, as it always does, between one world and the next. The fire had burned low, yet its warmth still held the room in a soft, steady glow. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, woven with the faint sweetness of bread left cooling near the hearth, and the dry tang of iron from the tools hanging by the wall. The man rose from his chair and stretched, his shadow climbing the wall behind him like a second body made of light and smoke. He added another log to the fire, the dry bark hissing as it met the heat. The flames caught slowly, licking up the edges until the wood glowed deep orange. The light spread again through the small room, brushing the faces of his family in flickering warmth. The wife moved quietly across the floor, her steps soft on the uneven boards. She poured what remained of the stew into a wooden bowl and set it by the door. It was not for them. No one spoke of it, but all knew its purpose. It was an old gesture from older lands, meant to keep the spirits of the night content and wandering elsewhere. The husband did not question it, though he kept his eyes on the floor while she worked. Some things, even in this hard, God-fearing colony, were still done without explanation. The children had grown quiet, their earlier whispers replaced by the kind of stillness that comes only after hours spent in the same room, when even small sounds feel large. The boy had fallen half asleep on the rug by the fire, one arm curled beneath his head. The girl sat beside him, turning a small piece of twine over in her hands, looping it again and again, lost in thought. The grandmother's spindle had gone still, resting on her lap. She watched the flames as though reading something within them. The hearth was the center of the house, the only place that felt alive once the sun disappeared. The fire was not only warmth, it was safety. Every evening before bed, the wife banked the coals carefully beneath ash, ensuring they would survive until morning. She always whispered a few words as she did it. Not a prayer, not exactly, but a line from her mother's voice she had never forgotten. "Keep the dark beyond the door," she would murmur, just above breath, while her hands worked the shovel. No one ever asked where the words came from. They had been spoken too long to be questioned. Outside, the sound of the wind shifted again, pressing softly against the shutters. The timbers groaned in quiet protest. The forest surrounding the settlement stretched wide and heavy, its black outline blotting the starlight. Sometimes, on nights like this, the settlers could hear strange things carried on the wind. Distant music, though no one played. Laughter, though no one was awake. The minister said such sounds were tricks of the devil, meant to tempt good Christians into curiosity. The older folk said they were only echoes of those who came before, voices that never found rest. The truth mattered less than the silence that followed. No one went outside to find out. The grandmother rose slowly, her knees stiff from sitting too long. She crossed to the shelf above the hearth and took down a small clay bowl filled with salt. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinched a bit between her fingers and scattered it into the flames. The fire crackled and flared, the salt hissing like a snake before vanishing into the coals. The children watched her. The boy asked what it was for. She answered without turning her head. "It keeps things pure," she said simply. And that was enough. The man nodded once. He had seen her do it every year since they built the house, and he had learned not to question the habits that seemed to keep peace through the long nights. There were other customs, quieter ones. An iron key always hung above the door. The broom leaned bristle up beside the frame, so spirits might not enter along its handle. The knife left beside the window was turned with its edge facing outward. None of these were discussed. They were part of life, as natural as tending the fire or fetching water. In the colonies, where land was vast and unknown, such things offered a sense of order when faith alone felt too distant. The wife knelt beside her son and pulled the small wool blanket higher over his shoulder. His breathing was even now, his lashes still against his cheek. She brushed a bit of soot from his temple with her thumb, the motion soft and practiced. Her daughter leaned against her knee, eyes half closed, but still listening. The grandmother's quiet hum began again, that same low tune that seemed to settle into the bones of the room. It wasn't joyful, not sorrowful either. It was something between, steady, familiar, as if the melody itself were older than anyone present. The father stood near the window and lifted one shutter just enough to look outside. The moon had climbed higher, its pale light pooling over the fields. The frost shone faintly where it clung to the grass. A silver sheet spread across the earth. The forest beyond looked almost still, but he could hear it breathe. The distant rustle of branches, the occasional crack of a limb under weight. The night creatures moved quietly, and somewhere in the dark a fox barked once, short and sharp. He let the shutter close and fastened it again. The cold air had followed him back into the room. He crossed to his chair and sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The knife and wood still rested on the table beside him, but he did not reach for them. His gaze drifted to the fire. The flames licked the blackened stone, curling around the fresh log he had placed there earlier. It was mesmerizing, the way fire moved, alive but never living, changing shape without rest. His mind wandered back to the sermons he'd heard in the meeting house, where the minister spoke of damnation as an eternal burning. But watching the hearth, he thought that the fire in his home was something different, something human. It took care to build and patience to sustain. It gave more than it demanded. The grandmother's hum deepened. The girl had finally let her head rest on her mother's lap. The boy stirred once in his sleep, muttering something inaudible before falling still again. The father felt the heaviness in the air, that thick stillness that comes before midnight. The wind outside had calmed. The sound of the forest had quieted. Even the crackling of the fire seemed softer. He could hear the slow, steady tick of the small wooden clock above the mantel. Each second stretched long. The wife's eyes lingered on the window. She could see her own reflection faintly in the glass, dark, flickering, shaped by the fire behind her. For a heartbeat, she thought another face moved beside hers, a trick of light perhaps. She turned slightly, and the reflection was gone. She said nothing. The grandmother's voice filled the space again, steady as before. "When the night grows too still, it's listening," she murmured. "Best to keep the fire talking." The father reached for the poker and shifted the log, breaking the silence with the small, satisfying sound of wood settling into flame. The hearth had its own kind of life. Everything revolved around it. The meals, the warmth, the safety, even the quiet gatherings when neighbours came by to trade stories. On nights like this, it was the line between comfort and fear. Beyond its light, the world seemed vast and uncertain. Inside it, there was a rhythm. The family's movements fell into it without thought. The wife stirring the pot, the grandmother spinning, the father carving, the children watching, listening, learning. This was how tradition survived, not by command, but by habit. A faint creak sounded from the ceiling beams, followed by another. The father lifted his head. It might have been the wood contracting in the cold, or something else entirely. The grandmother's fingers paused on her rosary beads, but did not stop. The fire popped, sending a thin shower of sparks into the air. The wife looked toward the noise, but said nothing. Silence settled again, heavy but not hostile. The sounds of an old house, in a long night. In the colonies, people learned early that silence had texture. There was the silence of sleep, soft and forgiving. There was the silence of suspicion, sharp and waiting. And then there was the silence of this night, thick, patient, aware. The settlers had no words for it that fit within their sermons or scripture, so they called it simply the hour of stillness. Some said it was when the boundary between the worlds was thinnest. Others said it was when the living world itself paused to breathe. The grandmother leaned forward, her face lined and calm in the firelight. "In the old country," she said quietly, "my mother would sweep the hearth before the clock struck 12. Said it kept the path clear for blessings to enter and for misfortune to leave." The wife reached for the broom without a word and began to sweep lightly, the bristles whispering over the stone. She moved slow, careful not to raise ash. When she finished, she placed the broom back in its corner, bristles pointing up. The grandmother nodded once and resumed her hum. The smell of ash and wood smoke filled the room, mingling with the faint scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Sage, thyme, and rosemary, all tied in small bundles, reminders of the summer now long gone. The wife had hung them not just for cooking, but for protection. A sprig of rosemary above the door was said to keep deceit away. The father had laughed when she tied it there the first time, but he had never taken it down. Midnight came slowly. The church bell did not reach this far, but they felt the change all the same. The air grew denser. The shadows leaned longer. The faint draught beneath the door grew colder. The grandmother's hum stopped. The boy shifted in his sleep. The firelight trembled, its glow pulsing once, then steadying. The father stood again and moved to the door. He placed his palm flat against the wood. It was cold, almost damp, though no rain had fallen. He left it there for a moment, feeling the temperature change, then stepped back. The wife had returned to her seat, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. The grandmother's eyes were half closed now, her lips moving soundlessly. The girl had finally drifted into sleep, her hands still tangled in the twine she'd been playing with. The father looked at them all, the small circle of life gathered around the hearth, and felt the faintest sense of peace. the kind that comes only in the midst of uncertainty. The fire's rhythm filled the room again, steady and constant. The smell of smoke clung to everything, their clothes, the beams, the walls. It was the scent of safety, of continuity. Outside, the wind shifted once more, brushing the house with a low sigh. The forest murmured in response, a faint chorus of unseen branches swaying together. The father sat, his gaze fixed on the flames, listening to that quiet language only long nights could teach. Beyond the walls, the world moved on. Somewhere, far off, a lantern guttered in another window. A fox passed along the edge of the field, its paws silent on the frozen ground. The stars shifted slowly in their cold expanse, and inside, the hearth continued to burn, its light the only boundary between the fragile world of the living and the patient dark that waited beyond the door. The old woman's hum returned once more, low and steady, carrying the same tone that had followed her across the ocean. The sound wove through the house like smoke, mingling with the breath of those who listened. The hearth glowed brighter for a moment, as though answering, and the night pressed on, unchanged, yet full of quiet meaning, carrying the small, flickering life of that single room into the long hours ahead. The fire settled, the embers pulsing softly, and though the family did not speak, they all felt the same thought move quietly among them, that the night was not yet done with its watching. The flames whispered, the timbers sighed, and beyond the edge of the light, the world remained wide, waiting and listening. The wind had turned colder by the time the embers began to dim. The night held its breath, and the small sounds within the room, the faint crack of the wood, the whisper of the grandmother's spinning wheel, the steady rhythm of the boys' breathing, seemed to echo louder than they should. The house had settled into the kind of stillness that only came after midnight, when even the dogs stopped barking, and the world outside became an unseen ocean of darkness. The fire no longer danced, it only glowed, red and deep, casting slow, uneven light across the room. The old woman sat closest to it. Her hands were folded now, resting on her lap, her eyes half open, reflecting the last of the firelight. She had lived through more winters than she could count, and she carried those years quietly, like layers of ash on stone. Her face bore the lines of old memory, the kind that cannot be spoken easily, because no one around her had lived them. The others had been born here in the colonies. This was the only home they knew. The fields, the forests, the wide unbroken sky. But she remembered something else, something older and heavier. Her breath caught the faintest tremor as she began to speak, so softly that for a moment it seemed the fire itself was listening. "When I was a girl," she said, "the nights were not so different. We feared the same things, though we named them otherwise." Her voice was thin but sure, carried by a rhythm that seemed to belong more to memory than to speech. Back home, we'd light candles on All Hallows' Eve. We'd set them on the windowsills and doorsteps so the lost souls could find their way. The old folks said it was cruel to let them wander. They'd grown cold where they'd gone, and the light reminded them there was still warmth in the world. The father looked toward her, his face lit faintly by the fire. He had heard fragments of these tales before, bits and pieces carried across the ocean with her, but never the whole of them. She only spoke them when the nights grew long enough, and the fire burned low enough that the past began to feel close again. The wife listened quietly, her hand resting on her daughter's hair, the boy still asleep by her feet. The old woman's voice moved with the rhythm of the flames. "We used to carve turnips," she said. "Hollow them out and set a light inside. Jack's lantern, they called it. To keep the wandering ones from mistaking your door for theirs. Some said it scared off the devils too. though I always thought it looked too kind for that. She smiled faintly, a small curve of the lips that did not reach her eyes. We hadn't pumpkins then. Those are your New World's doing. Big, soft things, easy to carve but too quick to rot. Back home, everything lasted longer, even the darkness. Her words fell into the air like dust, slow and fine. The wife shifted slightly, reaching to stir the embers with the poker. The sparks rose and fell again. "Did they believe in spirits truly?" she asked after a moment, her tone more curious than doubtful. The old woman nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Belief wasn't the word we used," she said. "We didn't need to. The world was smaller then, and closer. You could feel things breathing near you if you stood outside too long. The wind wasn't just air, it carried voices. The rain came with moods. If a candle blew out on its own, we didn't call it a draft. We lit another, and we spoke a name. Always a name." The girl stirred slightly, her eyes half open now, listening though she pretended not to. The father said nothing. He was a man of the colonies, raised under sermons and scripture, but something in her voice held his attention in a way that faith never quite did. He had seen the forest swallow men whole, seen crops fail for no reason, seen fires start where there was no flame. He did not say he believed her, but he did not say he didn't. The old woman's gaze had gone distant, turned inward to another place. "There were signs for everything," she continued. A robin singing at night meant death was near. A black cat crossing the threshold meant a visitor uninvited. And if you dreamed of running water, someone far away was thinking of you. She paused, the corner of her mouth twitching slightly. "But the strongest of all were the ones we made ourselves. The charms, the words, the small tokens. We wore them without question. Bits of iron, salt, a twist of red thread. My mother used to tie one to my wrist every All Hallows Eve. Said it confused the ones who drifted between worlds. They saw the red and forgot your name." The wife's hand instinctively touched the small cord tied beneath her sleeve. A habit from her youth, though she rarely thought of it. She had carried it across the sea, through storm and sickness, through winters and harvests, and she had never removed it. She had never told her husband why. The grandmother's eyes caught hers briefly, a faint flicker of understanding passing between them. The father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Those things were from before the church," he said quietly, though without judgment. The old woman nodded again. "Before and after," she replied. "Faith came and went, but fear stayed. We didn't think much about right or wrong in it. We did what kept us safe. And sometimes what kept us safe wasn't a prayer. It was a pinch of salt, a piece of iron, a whisper at the window. The fire crackled once, sharp and sudden. The boy stirred, rolling over in his sleep. The girl sat up now, her face pale in the half-light. "Grandmother," she said softly, "did they have witches there too?" The old woman's expression changed, a shadow of something moving behind her eyes. "Aye," she said finally, "or at least that's what we called them. Women who knew too much of herbs, or who walked alone too often. Men too sometimes, if they spoke of dreams. But most of them were only people who listened to the earth when others had stopped." Her tone was neither bitter nor forgiving. It was simply tired. "They feared what they could not name, so they gave it a name that burned." The father's jaw tightened slightly. Here in the colonies, that word carried weight. He had seen what accusation could do to a village. He did not speak it aloud, though it hung heavy in the air. The grandmother seemed to sense it, She looked toward the window, the faint draught stirring the edge of her shawl. The old country had its cruelties, she said softly. The new one has its own, but the fear beneath them is the same. The wife rose quietly and went to the door, checking the latch. It was still firm. She lingered there, hand resting on the wood, listening to the faint hum of the night outside. The forest seemed alive with stillness, as if every leaf were holding itself in place. She thought she heard something, a faint knocking, not at the door, but somewhere farther off, perhaps from the neighbouring house, or perhaps from nowhere at all. She waited until it faded before returning to her seat. The old woman's voice lowered. "When we left home," she said, "the minister told us we were leaving the old ways behind, that the new world would be free of superstition. But we carried it all the same. You cannot leave fear on a dock. It follows like a shadow." She reached toward the fire and stirred the coals with the iron poker, watching the sparks rise. The settlers here think they build on clean ground, but the earth remembers. Every step we take presses into something older. The father nodded, though he did not fully understand. The old woman's words had the weight of things felt but unseen. The fire popped again, sending a small puff of ash drifting into the air. The girl reached out and caught one on her finger, leaving a faint grey mark. The grandmother smiled faintly. "Ash for luck," she said. "Keep it till morning." The wind outside had shifted again, now moving through the trees in slow, deliberate gusts. The sound was less like wind now and more like breathing. The wife drew her shawl closer, her eyes darting once to the window. The old woman continued speaking, her tone almost a murmur. "There was a saying where I come from," she said. "Light for the living, shadow for the dead." It meant balance, that you couldn't keep one world entirely from the other. So long as we remember them, they'll remember us. The girl tilted her head, half understanding, half afraid. The father leaned back in his chair, his gaze on the flames. The wife reached for the pot on the hearth, ladling a bit of broth into a cup, though no one was hungry. The grandmother's voice seemed to fill the space between them, soft and endless, like a thread winding through time. "The old ways never left," she said. "They only changed their names. What you call luck, we called charm. What you call coincidence, we called omen. The world is full of signs, if you care to notice them. A candle that won't light, a dog that won't cross a threshold, a dream that feels like a warning. The ministers tell you to ignore such things, but the land listens whether you do or not." The father said nothing. The grandmother closed her eyes briefly, as if hearing something deep within the quiet. When she spoke again, her words were little more than a whisper. "The old country taught us that every soul leaves a trace, every breath, every word, every sin. When the nights grow long and the frost comes early, the traces wake. They look for warmth, for a doorway, for a name. That is why we light candles. That is why we leave bread, not to feed them, but to remind them we remember." The room fell still again. The fire had burned down to a deep, glowing bed of embers. The shadows had thickened, pooling in the corners where the light could not reach. The wife's eyes lingered on the bowl of bread near the door. The boy murmured in his sleep, a sound that almost resembled a name. The girl pressed closer to her mother. The grandmother's gaze drifted toward the window once more. Outside, the forest stood unmoving, the frost glittering faintly under the moon. The world felt stretched thin, as if the distance between here and there, past and present, had narrowed to a breath. Somewhere in that distance, the old country waited, not in place, but in memory, in fear, in every small act carried forward without thought. The grandmother's words had become part of the air now, mixed with the smoke and the warmth. The wind sighed against the walls again, a low sound like a whisper from across an ocean. The father stirred the fire once more, breaking the silence. The flames caught, brightening for a moment, pushing the shadows back just enough to remind them all they were still here, still breathing, still awake in this new world that was not new at all. The old woman's eyes closed. Her voice faded into the crackling of the fire. "It's all the same," she murmured. "The old country, the new. The names change, but the night remembers." The fire settled again, the room breathing with it, the faint sound of the wind beyond the walls like a slow heartbeat, steady and unending, carrying the memory of the old world quietly into the waiting hours of the new. The day had been short, and what little light the sun offered was already thinning across the horizon. The air carried a raw stillness that felt neither calm nor restless, but simply waiting. The settlement moved through its last motions before night. Chickens gathered near the coops, horses stamped in the frost, and the smell of smoke began to thread through the air as each chimney woke in turn. The colour of the sky shifted from pale grey to a dull violet that deepened with each breath of the wind. By the time the first lanterns were lit, the forest had turned black at its edges. The trees stood like a wall beyond the fields, dense and silent. The settlers had learned not to look too long into that darkness once the light began to fade. The line between the known and the unknown always seemed thinner then, and the forest did not take kindly to being stared at. The father stood outside for a moment, his coat pulled tight around his shoulders. He watched the faint glow rising from the chimneys along the road, small signals of life scattered across the plain. The sound of distant chopping echoed from somewhere beyond the ridge, someone cutting wood before the cold set in fully. It would be the last work of the day. The frost was already forming along the path, thin and white, crunching faintly under his boots. He turned toward the house again. The door stood open just enough for the smell of burning oak to drift through, mixed with the faint scent of herbs and broth. The air inside was warmer, thicker, but it carried the same quiet that hung outside, the kind that deepened just before the world changed from day to night. The grandmother sat near the fire, her spinning wheel idle now, her hands folded. The wife was at the table, cutting the last of the bread. The children moved quietly, careful not to disturb the balance that came with dusk. There was something about this hour that everyone in the settlement understood without needing to name it. It was not fear exactly, nor reverence. It was acknowledgement. The land itself seemed to draw a line at sunset. The day belonged to work, to reason, to noise. The night belonged to silence, to stories, to things that could not be measured. As the last light drained from the windows, the shift was felt in the bones. The father closed the door and fastened the latch. The grandmother's eyes followed the motion. "It's time," she said simply. She did not mean for supper. She meant for the evening to begin as it always did, quietly, with respect for whatever passed beyond the threshold. The wife set the knife down and lit another candle, its flame trembling as it caught. She placed it on the table and lowered her voice when she spoke. "The air feels heavier tonight." The old woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "The nights always grow heavier near the turning," she replied. "The veil doesn't lift, it sags." The girl stood near the window, peering through the small slit between the shutters. The fields beyond were fading fast. She could still make out the faint outline of the fence posts, the uneven shapes of the haystacks. the slow rise of the land where the forest began. A thin mist had started to gather along the ground, moving like breath. She watched it drift until her grandmother called her back. The wife crossed the room and drew the shutters closed. The soft click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. Outside, the sky had gone a deep blue-grey, the colour that sits between light and dark. The sound of the chopping had stopped. The village dogs had grown silent. The only noise now was the faint rhythmic creak of branches moving in the wind. It was not strong enough to shake them, only to make them speak to one another. The father moved to the hearth and stirred the coals. The fire caught again, brighter now, casting long orange shapes against the walls. Inside, the house settled into its rhythm. The old woman began to hum, her voice low, the same tune she always used when night came down. The boy leaned close to the fire, his face half hidden by shadow. The girl sat beside her mother and watched the candle flame. The wax had already begun to bend slightly from the heat. The father said nothing. He simply listened, the kind of listening that comes from long winters and long silences, when words seem to disturb the natural order more than they help it. The grandmother's hum broke for a moment. "In the old days," she said, "we used to open the windows at dusk, just a crack, so the souls could pass through without knocking." Her voice was not nostalgic, only factual. "Here, we keep them closed. The air here feels different, heavier, as if the spirits can't quite find their way." The wife looked toward the door, but said nothing. The sound of the fire filled the gap. The logs shifted, sending a shower of sparks into the chimney. The children watched them rise and vanish. The grandmother's eyes followed them too, her expression soft but distant. "There's a saying from home," she murmured. "If the smoke goes straight, the night will be kind. If it twists, something walks outside." The wife glanced up at the chimney. The smoke curled lazily, never quite straight. The grandmother saw it too, but didn't comment. Some things were better left unspoken. The father rose and crossed to the table, pouring himself a cup of water from the earthen jug. The surface trembled slightly as he set it down. He frowned, then dismissed it as his imagination. The old woman's gaze lingered on him a moment longer than usual. "You should mark the doorway," she said after a pause. "Just for the night." The wife fetched a small piece of chalk from the shelf. Without asking, she drew a simple line above the doorframe, a habit learned long before either of them had met. The father watched but did not interfere. Outside, the mist thickened, covering the fields in a low, rolling sheet that shimmered faintly under the weak light of the moon. The forest edge disappeared behind it. The trees reduced to vague silhouettes. The wind had died, but the air still moved in strange ways, carrying distant sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes it was a voice, sometimes the faint rhythm of footsteps, though no path lay beyond the fields. The settlers had heard such things before. They never tried to explain them. Inside, the children began to whisper. The boy asked if the mist was alive. The grandmother told him not to speak of it that way. "It's only the breath of the land," she said. "It gathers what we've forgotten and carries it back to where it belongs." Her tone left no room for questions. The boy nodded, pulling his blanket tighter. The wife began to clear the table, stacking the wooden plates carefully. The candle's flame wavered as she passed by, bending slightly toward her as if drawn. She paused, frowning, then continued her work. The father returned to his chair, his gaze on the hearth. The firelight painted everything in slow, shifting patterns, the colour of blood and amber. The grandmother's hum had turned quieter now, almost a murmur. The The smell of smoke drifted through the room again, thicker this time. It clung to their clothes, to the beams above, to their very breath. The girl wrinkled her nose but said nothing. The wife opened a small crack in the shutter to let the air move, though she knew it wouldn't help much. The grandmother's eyes followed the motion. "Just enough," she said softly. "Let the night know it's welcome to pass, not stay." The father reached for his coat. "I'll look to the animals before it gets too late," he said. The grandmother's eyes flicked toward him. "Stay close to the house." He nodded, though he already intended to. Outside, the cold hit sharper. The mist had thickened enough that the outlines of the barn and fences blurred into one another. He moved quickly, the frost crunching under his boots. The horses shifted restlessly, their breath visible in the pale light. He ran his hand down one's neck, the warmth of its skin a brief comfort against the chill. Everything seemed in order. Still, he felt the weight of the dusk pressing against him, the kind of pressure that made a man aware of how small he was beneath the open sky. As he turned back toward the house, something moved at the edge of his sight, a flicker between the trees, pale and silent. He froze, eyes straining against the dark. Nothing followed. The mist drifted, reshaping itself, and the shape was gone. He stood another moment, then forced himself to walk steadily back. His hand lingered on the latch before he entered. Inside, the air felt warmer, thicker, but it took a moment before that warmth reached his bones. The wife looked up from her chair, reading something in his expression. He shook his head once, a quiet assurance that needed no words. The grandmother's eyes lingered on him all the same. The girl watched, sensing the change without understanding it. The boy still slept, his breath slow and even. The grandmother reached for the small iron key hanging near the mantel and turned it once in her fingers. "Keep this close," she said, her tone more a statement than advice. The father hung it by the door, as he always did. The old woman nodded, satisfied. The fire flared as if in response, throwing a quick burst of light across the room. The dusk had passed fully into night now. The world outside had vanished into the mist, the moon's glow faint and uncertain. The fields were gone, the forest hidden. All that remained visible was the small circle of light spilling from the windows and the faint trails of smoke that drifted upward into the dark. The settlement was silent. Only the occasional creak of a roof beam or the sigh of the wind broke the stillness. Inside the house, the rhythm continued. The grandmother whispered under her breath, words too soft to catch. The wife smoothed the blanket over her daughter's shoulders. The father stirred the coals again, keeping the fire alive. The faint scent of rosemary and salt filled the air, a quiet mixture of comfort and caution. The night outside pressed close, patient and watchful, as if waiting for permission to speak. The old woman's voice returned, quiet and steady. "It's begun," she said, not as a warning, but as a statement of truth. The night listens now. Best we do the same. And so they did. The fire crackled, the shadows shifted, and the gathering dusk gave way to the long hours that would follow. Hours filled not with sleep, but with the slow, careful listening that had guided every soul through every All Hallows' Eve since the first one was ever named. The world beyond the door breathed, unseen but near, and the hearth glowed on, holding the fragile line between safety and the waiting dark. The hours after dusk passed with the slow patience of a held breath. The house had grown quiet again, though the quiet was not complete. The faint shifting of logs in the fire, the creak of the timbers, the soft turn of the grandmother's wheel from time to time. All of it carried through the still air, as if amplified by the silence itself. The mist outside pressed against the walls, thick enough now that even the windows glowed faintly with the reflection of the firelight. Inside, the warmth seemed to pull tight around them, a small circle of life against a great dark that waited patiently beyond. The father sat with his back to the door, a habit he had formed without thought. He had been raised to face what was ahead, but on nights like this, it felt wiser to keep his gaze on the room, to let the unseen stay unseen. The knife he had used for carving lay beside him on the table, the handle glinting dully in the low light. He was not a fearful man by nature, but the air tonight had a weight to it, a kind of charged stillness that made even small movements deliberate. The grandmother had stopped humming. Her eyes were open, reflecting the slow dance of the fire. "It's nearing the hour," she said softly. "You can feel it in the floorboards. The earth beneath us shifts." No one asked what she meant. The wife moved to the hearth and stirred the coals again, though they hardly needed tending. She dropped a few dried herbs into the flame, rosemary, sage, and a sprig of yarrow. The fire flared briefly, releasing a sharp, bitter scent that filled the room. The grandmother nodded. "That's good," she murmured. "Keeps the threshold strong." The girl sat up from her blanket, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Is it the witching hour now?" she asked. Her voice was small, careful. The grandmother looked at her with the kind of patience that comes from too many winters spent explaining the same truths to those too young to understand them. "Not yet," she said. "But the night grows restless before it comes. You'll know when it's close." The boy stirred but didn't wake. The wife lowered her voice. "Do we need to mark the windows?" she asked. The old woman nodded once. "Aye, chalk at the corners, and salt for the sill." She reached for the small clay bowl beside her chair, its surface scratched and stained from years of use. She pinched a bit of the coarse salt between her fingers and handed it to her daughter. "A thin line," she said. "No more, no less." The wife moved carefully from window to window, tracing the faint white powder along the wooden sills. She had done it many times before, though she never admitted aloud that she believed it helped. Her hand trembled slightly as she worked. The grandmother watched her without comment. The girl followed, carrying the stub of chalk, making small, uneven marks at the corners of the frames. The sound of it against the wood was faint, but sharp in the silence, each line a small act of defiance against whatever might linger outside. The father kept his eyes on the fire, his hand resting near the knife. The movement of his wife and daughter was familiar, almost rhythmic, and he found some comfort in it. When the grandmother spoke again, her tone was different, lower, almost like a chant. "The hour's not evil," she said. "It's only old. Things move then that used to move freely, before we built walls to keep them out. That's why we light candles and keep the fire strong. Not to drive them away, but to remind them we still remember." The wife finished her work and returned to the hearth. The grandmother gestured toward the door. "Now the threshold." The father rose slowly and fetched the iron key from its nail. He held it for a moment, feeling the cool weight in his hand. Without speaking, he pressed it against the wooden frame just above the latch, leaving a faint mark in the soft pine. The grandmother nodded again, satisfied. "Iron offends them," she said simply. "Always has." The room was quiet again, save for the steady crackle of the fire. The candle on the table had burned low, its flame bending toward the drafts that slipped through the cracks in the wall. The grandmother's gaze followed the movement. "Turn it east," she said. The wife obliged. adjusting the candle so its flame faced the window nearest the forest. "Let the living light see the dark," the old woman whispered. Outside, the mist moved differently now. It no longer rolled and drifted as before. It seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting like breath. The moon above it was dim and blurred, its shape distorted through the haze. The forest beyond was invisible. The father could hear faint sounds, branches shifting, a distant creak, like wood bending under unseen weight. He could not tell whether it came from the trees or from the house itself. The grandmother reached for a small bundle of dried lavender from the mantel. She broke it in half and handed one piece to the wife. "Hang it by the door," she said. "It keeps sorrow from crossing." The wife obeyed. The lavender crackled softly as she tied it with a thin strip of cloth. The scent mingled with the herbs burning in the fire, thick and sweet. The girl had taken her place near the grandmother now, her wide eyes reflecting the glow of the coals. "What happens if the fire goes out?" she asked. The grandmother's answer came without pause. "Then the night comes in." She said it plainly, without threat, as if describing the turning of the tide. The girl nodded slowly and did not ask again. The father poured himself a small cup of water and set it near the hearth. It was an old habit, something his mother had taught him long before the journey across the ocean. Water for reflection, she had called it. A still surface to catch what the eye might miss. The grandmother saw and gave a slight nod. "The old ways remember you," she said. The boy shifted again, half awake now. "Are there witches here?" he asked drowsily. His grandmother leaned closer to the fire, the light deepening the lines of her face. "Not as the ministers say," she replied. "There are only those who remember how to speak to the world when others forget. But the night doesn't care for names. It answers whoever listens." The wife glanced toward the window. The chalk marks looked faint in the dim light, almost like cracks in the wood. The salt line gleamed faintly, uneven but unbroken. She turned her gaze to the fire again, watching the way it caught the air in slow, steady breaths. The father rose once more and went to the small shelf above the hearth. From it, he took a candle made of beeswax, thicker and newer than the others. He placed it on the table and lit it with a coal from the fire. Its flame burned clean, taller than the rest. "For the crossing hour," the grandmother said approvingly. "One light for the living, one for the lost." The house seemed to breathe with the fire now. The shadows moved softly along the walls, never fully still. The girl leaned against her mother's knee, her eyes heavy but unwilling to close. The boy lay half asleep, murmuring in a voice too low to understand. The father sat back in his chair, the knife still within reach, though he did not touch it. The grandmother's eyes stayed on the fire, unblinking. The minutes stretched long. The sound of the wind outside shifted again. It no longer came in steady gusts, but in slow, uneven sighs, as if the forest itself were exhaling. The wife thought she heard something between those breaths, a faint tapping, irregular and light, like fingers brushing wood. She turned her head toward the door. The father heard it too. He did not move. The sound came again, softer this time, then stopped. The grandmother did not react. "They knock to be known," she said quietly. "But it's not always for harm. Sometimes it's only to be remembered." The wife felt the hair rise along her arms. She moved closer to the fire. The grandmother continued speaking in that same calm tone. "The witching hour is not cursed," she said. "It is the hour of truth. The world loosens its hold, and what was hidden remembers how to walk. The wise do not invite it, but neither do they deny it." The father exhaled slowly. The weight of the room pressed close. The candle on the table flickered, its flame bending low as if pulled by unseen breath. The boy stirred again, whispering something that sounded like a name, though none of them recognized it. The grandmother closed her eyes for a moment and whispered something of her own. Words too old to belong to this place. The fire responded, a quick surge of light, then settled. The tapping did not return. The mist outside held still as though listening. Inside, the warmth remained, though it carried an edge of strain, as if the air itself were holding steady against something pressing in from beyond. The grandmother's eyes opened again, calm and clear. "It passes if you let it," she said. "Don't fear the listening, just don't answer." The wife nodded faintly. The father leaned back, his shoulders easing a little. The girl yawned, her head resting on her mother's arm. The grandmother's wheel began to turn again, slow and steady, the thread winding like time itself. The fire burned on. The herbs had nearly vanished, leaving only faint trails of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. The lavender by the door swayed slightly in the draught, its scent strong and sharp. The candle's flame steadied once more, tall and golden, unbroken. The witching hour came quietly, no sudden change, no sound to mark its arrival, only a shift in the air, a soft deepening of the silence. The old woman felt it first, a subtle weight behind her ribs. The wife sensed it next, though she kept her hands busy with the thread she pretended to untangle. The father simply stared into the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames, waiting for them to tell him when the world had begun to move again. Outside, the mist receded slightly, as if drawn away by the same unseen tide that had brought it. The frost gleamed faintly along the path. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, its sound deep and hollow, a note that hung in the cold air before fading. The grandmother's spinning wheel slowed to a stop. "There," she said softly. "It's passing. The hour's done its turn." No one spoke for a long while. The fire cracked, the clock ticked, the candle flame held steady. The house breathed again. The wife brushed the ash from her apron and exhaled, her shoulders lowering. The father reached for the poker and shifted the logs, watching the sparks rise. The grandmother closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, clear and certain. "The night's not over," she said, "but it's kinder now." And the fire answered her with a soft hiss, sending a faint trail of smoke upward into the chimney, carrying with it the last whispers of the hour that had come and gone, unseen but felt by every heart that still listened for the sound of the world between worlds. The warmth deepened again. The mist outside began to drift back toward the fields. The lavender hung still, and the small house on the edge of the dark held its light steady, waiting for whatever the night would bring next. The mist had thinned by the time the fire settled into its slow, even rhythm again. The air inside the small wooden house felt heavier now, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet awareness that stretched between everyone in the room. The witching hour had passed, but what lingered in its wake was something the settlers could never quite name. A stillness that wasn't empty, but full. It pressed lightly at the edges of the walls, neither inside nor out, as if waiting for acknowledgement. The grandmother had gone silent. Her wheel stopped, her hands folded in her lap. The wife sat close to the hearth, her shawl pulled tight, watching the coals breathe in and out like a living thing. The father had risen once to check the latch, then stood with his hand against the door, feeling the faint pulse of the cold air on the other side. He stayed that way longer than he meant to. Outside, the world had grown pale with frost. The moon hung low over the fields, its light thin and unsteady as it passed through the drifting haze. The last of the harvest stubble glimmered faintly, each stalk catching the light like a line of bone beneath the skin of the earth. The land looked quiet, but anyone who had lived long enough through these seasons knew better. The fields were not empty. The settlers said the land slept after harvest, that it rested until spring. But the old woman remembered differently. Back home, she said, the fields were at their most restless after the last sheaf was cut. The grain held memory. It had grown in sunlight and died in shadow, and that change made it listen. When the scythes are put away, she had said once, the earth remembers who fed upon it. The fields know every hand that touched them. The father thought of those words now as he stepped outside. He carried a lantern, its light small and golden against the thick blue of the night. The frost cracked beneath his boots, each step sounding louder than it should. He had no reason to walk out there, not really. It was habit more than need. He told himself he was checking the animals, but he knew they were fine. The real reason was that he felt the pull, the strange unease that came after the witching hour, when the world seemed to breathe differently, when the edges between man and nature blurred. The lantern light stretched in a narrow path ahead of him, glinting off the frost-covered fence posts. Beyond them, the harvested field lay flat and white under the moon. The stubble stood stiff, rimmed with silver. For a moment, it almost looked like it was moving, just slightly, as though a faint breeze passed through it. But there was no wind. He stopped near the edge of the fence, holding the lantern higher. The glow caught on the tops of the stalks, and then disappeared into the fog. He listened. The sound that came back was soft, low, and uncertain. It might have been the distant shift of the frost, or the slow cracking of ice on the water trough. Or it might have been whispering. He turned toward the barn. The horses stirred as he approached, snorting softly, their breath rising in white plumes. He ran his hand along one's neck and whispered to calm it, though he wasn't sure why. The animal's ears flicked toward the open field, then back again. Its muscles quivered beneath his hand. The father looked out once more. The fog had thickened again, not rolling as before, but standing still, layered and heavy. The old woman's voice carried faintly from the house, a sound he could not make out but recognized all the same. She was speaking the old words again, the ones she used when the air turned strange. He felt something loosen in his chest, as though the sound itself anchored him. The mist shifted slightly, almost breathing with the rhythm of her voice. He turned back toward the house and began walking. Inside, the wife looked up as he entered. He closed the door quickly, setting the lantern down by the hearth. "All's well," he said, though his voice was low. The grandmother's eyes stayed on him for a moment longer than comfort allowed. Then she nodded, satisfied, as if she had already known what he would say. The girl had not fallen asleep again. She sat by the window, her chin resting on her hands, peering through the narrow crack in the shutter. "It looks like smoke out there," she whispered, like the fields still burning. Her mother joined her, opening the shutter just enough to see. The mist rolled close to the ground, glowing faintly under the moonlight. The frost shimmered beneath it, catching and releasing light in slow waves. It did look like smoke, cold fire moving across the earth. The grandmother spoke without looking up. "That's them walking," she said, "the ones who worked the land before us. They come to see if the harvest's been honored." Her tone carried no fear, only certainty. If the fields are left unblessed, they wander. The ground remembers every hand that cut it, every back that bent to it. You can't take from the earth without leaving something behind. The wife let the shutter fall back into place. You think it's the dead? She asked quietly. The old woman's gaze shifted toward the fire. It's memory, she said. The land doesn't forget, even when we do. Some memories don't die. They wait. The father sat beside the hearth, his hands out toward the warmth. Then we'll honor it, he said simply. The grandmother nodded again. She reached for a small bundle from the shelf, a sprig of dried corn husk tied with twine. This will do, she said. Hang it near the door till sunrise. The wife took it and did as she was told, tying it above the frame. The rustle of the husks sounded faintly like whispering in the quiet room. The old woman's voice softened. In the old country, we used to leave the last sheaf standing, she said. They called it the spirit of the harvest. You never cut it, never touched it. You let it watch the field through the winter. Here they take everything. They forget that even the earth needs its offering. The girl looked toward her father. Will we leave something next year? She asked. The father smiled faintly. Maybe we should. The grandmother's eyes warmed for the first time that night. It's good to be remembered by the land, she said. It speaks kinder to those who show respect. Outside, the frost glowed brighter, as if reflecting the fire from within the house. The mist moved again, slow and deliberate. The father rose and looked through the small window pane. The field seemed to shift under the moonlight, the stalks bending as though brushed by unseen hands. He felt no fear now, only recognition. The land was alive, and they were its guests. The grandmother's hands moved slowly as she drew a shape in the air before her. A small circle, then a cross through it. The wife watched her silently. For balance, the old woman murmured. For rest. The fire popped softly, sending up a brief shower of sparks that curled and vanished. The girl leaned closer to her mother. The boy, still asleep, muttered something that sounded like the word home. The wife brushed the hair from his face and looked back toward the fire. Do you think they see us? She asked. The grandmother's voice came quiet but sure. They see the light, she said. That's all they need. The living flame tells them we remember. The father stirred the coals again, spreading them evenly across the hearth. The glow reached higher, painting the beams in soft gold. The warmth filled the room, chasing away the last chill. Outside, the mist began to drift toward the forest, carrying its faint light with it. The frost remained, shimmering in its wake like a trail of ghosts that had found their way home. The grandmother leaned back in her chair, her eyes half closed. It's good, she said softly. They've been answered. The house seemed to breathe with her words. The walls creaked once, the floor settled, and the sound of the wind returned. Not strange this time, but steady, familiar. The wife felt her shoulders ease for the first time since dusk. The girl yawned, her eyelids heavy. The boy slept without stirring. The father looked toward the window one last time. The fields were still again, blanketed in frost, the mist gone. The horizon held the faintest suggestion of blue, not yet dawn, but the promise of it. He returned to his chair, the light of the fire soft against his face. The grandmother spoke again, her voice barely more than a whisper. Every harvest feeds two worlds, she said. One of the living, one of the remembered. The work is the same, only the hands differ. The wife nodded, her eyes on the fire. Then we've done our part, she said quietly. The grandmother smiled faintly, her gaze lost somewhere far away. For now, she said, till spring comes and the fields wake hungry again. The house fell silent after that, not from fear, but from a calm understanding. The fire burned low, steady and even. The night outside had softened, the frost no longer gleaming so sharply. The mist had moved fully into the forest, leaving the land clear beneath the pale light of the moon. The father leaned back, his hand resting on the table. The wife reached to take it without speaking. The grandmother's breathing slowed. The children slept. The air inside the house carried the faint scent of lavender, smoke, and cold earth, reminders of the night's passage and of the world that continued quietly beyond the walls. Somewhere outside, a single owl called again, its voice low and certain, as if marking the end of the hour. The grandmother's eyes opened slightly. "That's a good sign," she said softly. "It means the fields are quiet." The father nodded, though he didn't need the reassurance. The house had settled. The night had accepted them. And in the still air between the fire and the frost, the living and the remembered shared the same breath, each aware of the other, each content for now to let the world remain as it was. The grandmother's hand rested lightly on her spindle again, though she didn't spin. "Best keep the fire strong till dawn," she murmured. "The land's had its say. Let it sleep." And so the fire was fed once more, the coals glowing deep red, the warmth steady and certain. The house stood small but sure against the vast, listening dark, its light the only mark of life amid the sleeping fields, where spirits still walked, unseen but not unwelcomed, through the hours that would carry them all slowly toward morning. The fire had burned low again, its glow dim and steady, no longer the lively dance it had been earlier in the night. The embers gave off a soft hum, a quiet, almost living sound that filled the space between the creak of the boards and the whisper of the wind outside. The grandmother sat motionless in her chair, her eyes half closed, the spindle resting against her knee. The children slept, though not deeply, the kind of rest that drifts in and out of dreams. The father leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring into the hearth as if the shapes within the flames might arrange themselves into meaning. The wife moved quietly, her footsteps light on the uneven floor. She reached for the small cupboard beside the hearth and took down a wooden bowl. Inside were the last of the apples from the harvest, their skins dull in the firelight. She placed them on the table, then reached for a knife. The blade glimmered faintly as she turned one of the apples in her hand. The grandmother's eyes opened. "You're doing it tonight," she said. It was not a question. The wife paused, then nodded. "It's the night for it." The old woman said nothing more, only watched. The girl stirred at the sound of the knife cutting through the apple. Her eyes opened, half awake. "What's she doing?" she whispered. The grandmother leaned toward her slightly. "She's seeing," she said. "The night tells those who listen, but you mustn't ask what it shows." The girl sat up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. The boy turned in his sleep, his face half buried in his arm. The father looked up briefly, but did not interrupt. He had seen this before. Every All Hallows Eve, his wife would take one apple from the bowl, peel it slow, and drop the skin behind her shoulder. She said it was a custom from her mother's village, a way to glimpse the future if done at the right hour, under the right silence. She began now, her movements calm and deliberate. The knife traced a thin spiral of skin, curling away from the flesh in one long strip. The room stayed still. Even the fire seemed to quiet, its sound lowering to a faint, steady breath. When the peel finally separated, she turned her hand and let it fall to the floor. It landed softly, the coil unfolding into a loose shape. The girl leaned forward to see. It wasn't quite a letter. Not really. but something close. The grandmother smiled faintly. "It's enough," she murmured. "The signs are never clear. They only point." The wife placed the knife aside, her expression unreadable. She picked up the apple's core and dropped it into the fire. The scent rose sharp and sweet, filling the room with the smell of burnt sugar and smoke. The grandmother's gaze followed the thin line of ash that curled up from it. "Fire takes truth kindly," she said. "Better to burn what you've asked of than to leave it waiting." The girl watched her mother's hands. "Does it really show the future?" she asked. The grandmother turned her head slowly. "It shows what wants to be seen," she replied. "Sometimes that's not the same thing." The father reached for the poker, shifting the embers. The glow deepened, shadows stretching across the floor. "The minister would call it foolishness," he said quietly. "He says there's danger in seeking what isn't meant to be known." The old woman looked at him, her eyes steady. "The minister never lived by a field that wouldn't grow," she said. "He never watched a child fall sick with no reason. We look because we must. If the world won't speak plain, we take what words it gives." The wife set the remaining apples back in the bowl. "It's not for harm," she said softly. "It's only for knowing where the heart stands." The grandmother nodded once. That's what fortune truly is, where the heart finds itself when the dark is near. The girl's curiosity had grown. "Are there other ways to see?" she asked. The grandmother's mouth curved slightly, though not quite into a smile. "Too many," she said, "and most better left alone." But the girl pressed, as children do. "Tell me one." The old woman sighed, looking into the fire. "When I was young," she said, "we melted lead in a spoon and poured it into cold water. The shape it made would tell your fortune. A ring for marriage, a key for travel, a cross for sorrow. My sister saw a broken wheel once. The next spring, her husband's cart overturned in the ravine." The girl's eyes widened. The father said nothing. The wife crossed herself without thinking, a gesture she rarely made, except in moments like this. The grandmother noticed, but didn't comment. "There's another," the old woman continued after a moment. "You peel an apple, same as before, and eat it before the mirror by candlelight. If you look long enough, you'll see the face of the one you'll wed. But you mustn't speak, and you mustn't look away until the flame wavers. The mirror doesn't lie, but it doesn't promise kindness either." The wife's hand tightened around the edge of the table. "You did that?" she asked quietly. The grandmother's gaze turned distant. "Once," she said. That was enough. No one spoke for a while. The only sound was the faint hiss of the apple core turning to ash. The boy stirred again, waking fully this time. He rubbed his eyes and looked around, confused. "Is it still night?" he asked. The father nodded. "For a while yet." The boy glanced at the apples on the table. "Are they for eating?" The grandmother shook her head. "Not tonight." The boy frowned, half puzzled, half disappointed. "Then what are they for?" he asked. The old woman's voice softened. "For listening," she said. "The living have words, but the world has signs. Apples, water, flame. They listen when we forget how." He didn't understand, but he didn't ask again. The wife handed him a piece of bread instead, and he ate it quietly by the fire. The father leaned back in his chair. "You think the world speaks to us," he said to the grandmother. She met his gaze evenly. "It always has," she replied, "but not in the tongue we use for trade or prayer. It speaks in turning leaves, in broken glass, in dreams that repeat. We forget how to hear it because we fear what it might say." The fire shifted, sending a long shadow across the ceiling. The wife's eyes followed it, tracing the uneven lines until it faded. "Sometimes I think it speaks through luck," she said. "Good or bad, depending on what we've done." The grandmother nodded. "That's the oldest kind of talk. Fortune isn't chance. It's memory. Every kindness and every cruelty leaves its mark. The world answers in kind, whether we see it or not." The girl tilted her head. "Then can we change it?" she asked. "Can we make it better?" The old woman smiled faintly. "By living gentle," she said. "By leaving offerings for what you take. By never mocking what you don't understand. The rest is beyond us." The father stirred the fire again, more to keep his hands busy than for need. "You sound like the minister when he speaks of sin," he said. The grandmother's tone stayed even. "The ministers speak of fear. I speak of balance. Fear binds the heart, but balance keeps it whole." The wife rose and fetched a small dish from the shelf. Inside were coins, 3 dull with age. She set them on the table. "For the river," she said quietly. The grandmother nodded, her eyes soft. "Old country habit," she said. "Coins for crossing, should the unseen pass too close." The father said nothing. He had grown used to these gestures. In truth, they brought him comfort, though he'd never admit it aloud. The girl touched one of the coins lightly. "What if we don't leave them?" she asked. The grandmother's answer came slow. "Then something will be taken in their place." The wind pressed against the shutters, a low sighing sound that made the candle flame tremble. The wife placed the coins back in the dish and set it near the window. The old woman murmured something under her breath, a line too soft to catch. The fire flared briefly, then returned to its steady glow. The boy yawned, his eyelids heavy again. The girl rested her head on her mother's shoulder. The grandmother began humming, low and steady, her voice blending with the crackle of the fire. The father leaned back, his eyes closing briefly. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of the forest, branches rustling, dry leaves scattering. The mist had thinned, but the frost still caught the moonlight, turning the field into a pale, glittering plain. The grandmother's hum grew softer. "There are fortunes we're meant to know," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "And there are those we meet by living long enough. The tokens only remind us of what's already waiting." The wife reached for her hand. The old woman's skin was cool but steady. "Do you ever wish you didn't know so much?" the wife asked softly. The grandmother's eyes turned toward the fire. "Sometimes," she said, "but it's better to know the rules of the dark than to walk blind through it." The fire snapped once, sending up a small burst of sparks that drifted toward the chimney. The girl watched them until they disappeared. The grandmother's voice dropped to a murmur again. "The dark doesn't hate the light," she said. "It only asks to be seen." The wife brushed the ash from the hearth, her movements slow and careful. The old woman's words hung in the air, soft but certain. The night had grown quieter, the wind now no more than a breath against the walls. The frost outside gleamed faintly, and the mist had retreated to the forest's edge. The father opened his eyes again, his voice low. "Then maybe we'll leave an apple by the door," he said. The grandmother smiled, her expression unreadable. "That's wise," she said. "The world likes to be remembered." The wife placed one of the apples on a small plate and set it near the threshold. The girl watched, her curiosity now mixed with the heavy calm of sleep. The boy was already dreaming. The fire dimmed to a soft red glow. The grandmother's hum faded into silence. The house breathed in rhythm with the night outside, slow, steady, unbroken. Beyond the walls, the The frost thickened once more. The fields were still. The world waited. And in the small house at the edge of the forest, the living and the unseen shared the same space in peace, bound by the same quiet understanding that had carried every soul through every All Hallows Eve before, and would carry them still through the rest of this long and listening night. The night had gone still again, the kind of stillness that seemed to hold sound rather than silence. The fire burned low, no longer bright, but steady, its heart a deep red that pulsed softly, like breath. The air inside the small house felt close, not stifling, but thick with the weight of wakefulness. It was too late for sleep and too early for dawn. These were the hours that didn't belong to any part of the day, the space between the known and the waiting. The grandmother sat by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes reflected the glow of the coals, sharp and clear despite her years. She had not moved in a long time, and the lines of her face looked carved by both shadow and time. The father sat across from her, silent, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The wife had drawn the children closer together beneath a single blanket. The boy slept soundly, but the girl still stirred now and then, half awake, her small fingers tracing the edge of the wool. No one spoke for a long while. The fire filled the silence, its soft crackle like an old voice speaking just beyond hearing. The grandmother tilted her head slightly, as if listening. The wife noticed and frowned. "Do you hear something?" she asked quietly. The old woman's gaze didn't shift from the fire. "Always," she said. "But tonight it carries clearer. The air's thin now. Words move easier through it." The father looked up. "You mean the wind?" The grandmother's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, if that's what you need it to be. The wife shook her head lightly and leaned back against the wall. She had grown used to her mother's ways, half belief, half habit, but tonight the air carried something different. There was a stillness that wasn't peace, a quiet that wasn't rest. She rubbed her arms through her shawl, though the room was warm. The old woman leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "When I was young," she said, "we used to sit like this when the nights grew long. The men told stories of storms at sea, of ships that sailed too far and found places that weren't on any map. The women told other stories of those who walked after death, not to frighten, but to remember." The girl's eyes opened at that, wide and bright in the firelight. "Stories about ghosts," she whispered. The grandmother's gaze flicked to her. "We didn't call them that. Ghosts are what you fear. These were what you missed." The girl frowned, trying to understand. The grandmother continued, her voice steady and low, every word seeming to settle in the air before moving on. There was one story they told every All Hallows Eve. It was about a woman who waited by her fire for her husband to come home. He'd gone to sea that morning, though the fog was thick and the tide unkind. The others said he'd be lost, but she refused to believe it. She sat by the fire all night, whispering his name to the flames so he might find his way by her voice. The fire crackled once, louder than before. The old woman didn't pause. When dawn came, there was a knock at her door. She opened it and found his coat hanging there, still damp with seawater. No man, only the coat. Some say the sea returned what it couldn't keep. Others say the fire had answered her call and taken pity. The wife crossed herself without thinking. The father said nothing, but his eyes stayed fixed on the hearth. The girl pressed closer to her mother, her voice barely above a breath. "Did she ever see him again?" The grandmother shook her head slowly. "Not with her eyes, but she said she felt him sometimes, when the tide was high and the wind came from the east. Said it felt like warmth on her shoulder. Not comfort, not sorrow, just presence. The room fell quiet again. The wife stirred the coals with the poker, sending a faint shower of sparks into the chimney. The smell of burnt apple still lingered, sweet and strange. The girl's eyes followed the rising smoke. "Tell another," she said softly. The grandmother tilted her head slightly. "You're sure?" The girl nodded. The old woman's tone changed. "There was a boy once," she began. "Not much older than you. He used to wander the fields after sunset, though he'd been told not to. Said he liked how quiet it was when the world stopped working for the day. One evening, he saw a light moving between the rows. Thought it was his father with a lantern, so he followed it. But the closer he got, the farther it drifted, until it reached the edge of the wood. He kept after it, and the light went out. When they found him in the morning, he was sitting on a fallen tree, sound asleep. Said he'd been listening to someone sing, though no one else heard it. The next night, the light came again. His mother locked the door and prayed till sunrise. He never spoke of it after." The girl swallowed. What was the light? The grandmother's eyes were distant now. Some said it was a spirit leading him astray. Some said it was his own longing given shape. But my mother said the land itself has ways of calling to those who listen too hard. The world doesn't like to be followed. The father rubbed his hands together, the rough sound grounding him. And yet here we are, surrounded by what we can't help but listen to. The grandmother's gaze softened. That's why we tell the stories. They remind the dark we're not deaf to it. The wife glanced at her daughter. The girl's eyes were wide, caught between fear and fascination. "Enough for tonight," the wife said gently. But the old woman wasn't finished. "There's one more," she said. "One that belongs to this place, not the old country." The father looked up. "You mean here?" The old woman nodded. "The settlers who came before us built their houses close to the woods. They said the soil was rich, but they didn't know why. A few years in, the crops began to fail. Not from drought, not from rot, just emptiness. Seeds wouldn't take. One autumn, a man went to dig a new well and struck something beneath the earth. It wasn't stone, it was wood, shaped and joined like part of an old floor. They uncovered more of it, timbers and beams, all blackened with age. There'd been a house there long before theirs." The wife's eyes narrowed. "What happened to it?" "No one knew," the grandmother said. "No records, no names. But the ground remembered. That winter, the family who dug there said they heard voices at night. Soft ones, like whispering through walls. They thought it was the wind. Then they started hearing footsteps, moving slow from one end of the field to the other. Every night, at the same hour. They tried praying, tried salt, tried staying awake with the lamps lit. Nothing changed. Then one night, the wife went out to the well and called into it. She said, "If it's you, be at peace. We mean no harm." The fire popped, sending up a small flare of light that made the wife flinch. The grandmother's voice didn't waver. After that, the sound stopped. But the next spring, the first crop they planted grew stronger than ever. They said the ground had forgiven them. The father nodded slowly, or been reminded of kindness. The grandmother smiled faintly. That's the same thing, sometimes. The girl's voice was barely audible. "Do you believe it?" The grandmother looked at her. "I've learned not to question stories that stay alive. They hold truth, even when the truth isn't clear." The fire shifted again, its glow deepening to a soft orange. The room felt warmer now, though none of them had moved closer. The wife reached for a small piece of bread and placed it near the hearth. The grandmother's gaze followed the motion. "Good," she said softly. "The old ones listen better when fed." The boy stirred again, murmuring something in his sleep. The girl lay down beside him, her eyes half closed. The father leaned back in his chair, his face soft in the glow of the fire. The wife sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. The old woman's voice lowered once more. "The stories aren't for fear," she said. "They're for remembering. The dark listens when we speak kindly of it." The fire crackled, the coals settling deeper into themselves. The wind outside had quieted to almost nothing. The frost thickened along the window panes, tracing faint white veins across the glass. The room felt sealed from the world, wrapped in its own time. The grandmother's hum returned, slow and even, barely louder than breath. The wife closed her eyes, her hand still on her husband's arm. The children drifted deeper into sleep. The father watched the fire until the shapes of the flames blurred, the line between waking and dreaming soft as the smoke that rose into the chimney. The old woman stayed awake the longest. She watched the last of the sparks fade, her expression calm. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost lost to the sound of the burning wood. "The fire tells its own stories too," she said, "if you listen long enough." And so, they did not speak again for a while. The flames whispered, the timbers sighed, and beyond the walls, the fields and forest stood silent, listening in turn. The night held them all in the same breath, those who spoke, those who slept, and those who only listened. The air in the house shifted once more, gentle and familiar, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and cold earth. The hour had moved on, though no one could tell how far. Time had become another story told by the fire, slow and endless, echoing softly in the quiet space between life and the unseen. The old woman leaned back at last, her eyes never leaving the hearth. "It's a good night," she murmured. "They've heard us kindly." The wife opened her eyes, her voice no more than a whisper. "Then let it stay that way." The grandmother nodded, her gaze steady on the fire. "It will," she said, "so long as we keep the flame talking." The logs settled, the coals breathed, and outside the wind turned once, low and brief, like a sigh, satisfied to move on. Inside, the room held its warmth, the voices of the living and the quiet of the remembered woven together, indistinguishable in the fading hours before the next stirring of the dark. The night had grown long enough that time no longer seemed to move in any direction. It stretched, soft and heavy, like the air itself had slowed to a waiting hush. The fire had burned down to a low, steady bed of embers. The light they gave off was enough to paint the walls in shades of red and shadow, but no more. The air smelled of smoke, salt, and the faint sweetness of burnt apple still clinging to the stone. The grandmother sat perfectly still, her hands folded over her lap. She had not spoken for some time, her eyes half closed, her breathing slow and measured. The father sat opposite her, his posture slouched now, his face turned slightly toward the hearth. The wife leaned against the wall with her daughter sleeping against her shoulder. The boy stretched out near the fire, his small hand half buried in the blanket's edge. It might have been peace, except for the sound that came then, soft, faint, but unmistakable. A knock. It was not loud, it wasn't hurried. It was a slow, deliberate sound, as if whoever or whatever made it wanted to be certain it was heard, but not answered. One, then two, then silence. The father looked up, his face sharpening in the dim light. The wife froze, her hand tightening around her daughter's shoulder. The grandmother's eyes opened fully, her expression calm but alert. No one moved. The knock came again, 3 times, evenly spaced. The father rose from his chair, the floor creaking softly beneath him. He glanced toward the window, though the shutters were closed tight. The mist outside had returned, pressing faint light against the wood. The old woman's voice broke the silence before he could take another step. "Don't answer." The words were quiet, but firm. The father stopped. "It could be a neighbor," he said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. "It isn't," she said. "No one walks in the fog after the hour's turned." The wife's eyes moved toward the door. The lantern beside it had burned low, its flame trembling inside the glass. The knock came again, softer now, almost polite. The father stood still. "And if it keeps on?" he asked. The grandmother looked toward the fire, her face cast in orange light. "Then we wait. It's not come to harm, only to remember it can still be known." The knock stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than before, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The wife whispered, "What does it want?" The grandmother's eyes shifted toward her. "Not want," she said. "It only wants to be remembered. The ones who wander, they don't seek, they remind." The fire snapped once, loud enough to make the children stir. The girl's eyes fluttered open. "Someone's at the door," she murmured sleepily. The wife smoothed her hair. "No one you need to worry for, love," she said. The girl blinked, then turned her gaze toward the door. "They're cold," she said softly. "They want warmth." The grandmother's head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. "You see more than most," she said, "but don't look too long. The night doesn't like to be stared at." The wife held her daughter close. The father exhaled slowly. He turned back toward the fire, his hand brushing the hilt of the knife on the table. The grandmother leaned forward, her voice lower now. "When I was a girl, my father told of the visitations," she said. "He said on nights when the air feels thick and the frost comes early, the dead wander where their names are still spoken. Not to haunt, just to listen. They pass by houses where their kin once lived, where their laughter still lingers in the walls. They listen for a sound that reminds them of what it was to be alive." The wife's voice was barely a whisper. "And if they find it, then they move on," the grandmother said simply. "If they don't, they linger, and lingering becomes hunger." The word hung in the air, cold and solid. The father stirred the fire again, though his hands shook slightly. The iron poker scraped against the stone, the sound sharp in the heavy quiet. "How do we make them move on?" The old woman's eyes stayed on the fire. With light, with warmth, with kindness. The living forget that memory is a kind of hunger too. Feed it, and it leaves full. The wife glanced toward the door. "Then we should leave something," the grandmother nodded once. "Bread will do. And a light?" The wife rose carefully, not to wake the girl. She took the small plate from the table, the same one that had held the apple earlier, and placed a piece of bread upon it. Then she lifted the lantern from its hook, the flame trembling but still alive, and set it near the threshold. The glow reached only a few feet beyond the door, spilling faintly across the floor. The grandmother began to hum again, low and slow, her voice thin but strong. It was not a song meant for the living, though it carried no fear. It was a sound that filled the space between breaths, between knocks, between what was seen and what was felt. Outside, something shifted. Not a step, not a sound, just a change in the air, a small loosening. as if whatever had pressed so close to the door had begun to drift away. The girl stirred again, her voice small and clear. "They're leaving," she said. The wife froze. "How do you know?" The girl's eyes stayed half closed. The cold's gone. The grandmother's hum stopped. She sat back, her expression unreadable. Then they've had their remembering. The father exhaled, his shoulders lowering. The wife returned to her chair, her movements careful and slow. She looked toward the lantern by the door. Its flame burned steady now, no longer trembling. The grandmother spoke again after a moment. "Sometimes they come for faces, sometimes for names, sometimes just for warmth, but always only for a while. They're not cruel." Just unfinished. The father looked toward her. "You've seen them?" Her gaze did not move from the fire. "I felt them," she said. "When the air grows heavy and the floorboards creak like footsteps. When you wake in the night and smell earth where there should be none. That's how they pass, quiet but certain." The wife wrapped the blanket tighter around her daughter. The boy stirred in his sleep, turning his face toward the hearth. Outside, the frost deepened, spreading like lace across the window panes. The world had grown still again. Even the sound of the forest had gone. The grandmother leaned back, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. "Once, back home," she said, "my mother heard a knock like that. 3 times, same as now. She said it was her brother, gone 2 winters before. She opened the door and found nothing but a feather on the step. She kept it till the day she died. Said it was proof the dead still find their way back when called by love, not fear." The wife's eyes softened. Did it frighten her? The old woman shook her head. No, it comforted her. She said the world's thinner than we think. Not a wall between, just a curtain. The father looked toward the window. The mist had started to drift again, slow and calm. "And when that curtain lifts, then remembering becomes meeting," the grandmother said, "but only for a moment." The fire popped once more. The lantern near the door flickered, then steadied. The house seemed to exhale. The wife's shoulders eased. The girl's breathing deepened again. The grandmother closed her eyes briefly, her voice fading to a murmur. "The visitations come to those who listen, not to frighten, but to be heard one last time." The wife looked toward the door. The bread still sat on the plate, untouched, but no longer cold. She couldn't explain how she knew, but it felt as though someone had accepted it. The father spoke softly. "Then we'll leave it till dawn." The grandmother nodded. "That's the way." They all fell silent again. The wind outside began to stir, faint but constant, moving through the trees in slow waves. The sound was no longer eerie but almost soothing, like the rhythm of a distant sea. The house creaked softly in response, as though settling after holding itself too long. The grandmother's breathing had grown shallow. She was tired now, her words spent. The wife watched her with quiet understanding. The father stirred the fire once more, not from need, but from ritual. The red light filled the room, deep and soft. The night felt lighter somehow, not as close, not as heavy. The unseen had passed, leaving behind only the faint scent of earth and a strange, still peace. The grandmother opened her eyes again, her voice barely a whisper. "It's good they found the door closed," she said. "That means they remember we're still among the living." The wife smiled faintly. "And they'll rest?" "For now," the old woman said. "Till next they're called by the wind or the scent of home." The fire crackled once more. The lantern flame held steady. The frost on the glass began to fade in small, uneven patches where the warmth touched it. The father sat back in his chair. The wife leaned her head against his shoulder. The children slept without stirring. Outside, the mist rolled back toward the forest, slow and graceful, as though retreating with the dawn not yet risen. The old woman closed her eyes again, her hand resting lightly against her spindle. The night had returned to its rhythm. The house stood quiet, its walls breathing gently with the shifting air. The visitations had come and gone, leaving behind no sign except the bread cooling on the plate and the faint hum of the world remembering itself. And so the family sat through the remaining hours, their hearts steady, their fire alive, their small light holding its place in the vast dark that listened still, waiting for the first colour of morning to stir against the edge of the world. The hour had grown hollow, that stretch of night when the flame no longer seems to move and every sound feels distant, as though the world itself is holding its breath. The house stood in that stillness, wrapped in its own quiet. The fire had sunk low again, the coals dimming to the deep colour of old blood. The air carried the smell of ash and salt, a faint sweetness from the bread left near the door. The lantern's light trembled slightly, its small flame bending toward every shift of the air, like it too was listening. The grandmother had drifted half into sleep, her chin low against her chest, her breathing shallow but even. The wife sat with her daughter curled beside her, both still wrapped in the same heavy shawl. The boy was fully asleep, one arm stretched toward the hearth, his hand resting inches from the heat. The father sat upright in his chair, too tired to move, too alert to rest. He had learned over the years that there were parts of the night not meant for sleep, the hours when the world went quiet in unnatural ways, when even thought felt loud. The wind outside had stopped completely. The forest, usually full of creaks and sighs, stood mute. The sound of the coals shifting was the only thing left alive in the air. Then came another sound, so faint that he wasn't sure it was real. It was a long, drawn-out note, almost like a hum, rising from somewhere beyond the walls. The kind of sound that could have come from the trees or the earth itself. The grandmother stirred, her eyes opening at once. "It's begun," she said softly. The wife looked up. "What has?" "The signs," she said. "The night speaks before the dawn. It tells what's to come, if we know how to listen." The father rubbed his temples. "And if we'd rather not know?" The grandmother gave a slow, small shrug. "Then close your eyes. The night doesn't care if you're ready." The wife turned her gaze toward the window. The frost had spread again, not in straight lines, but in twisting shapes that seemed almost deliberate. She leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. The frost had formed patterns, circles and spirals, lines meeting in precise angles. It looked like something drawn by a careful hand. She touched the glass, but the cold bit sharply at her fingers. She pulled back, her breath leaving a small fog across the pane. When it cleared, the patterns were gone. The grandmother had seen her move. "They show themselves and vanish quick," she said. "You're not meant to hold the sight, only the knowing of it." The father turned toward the door. The bread still sat where it had been placed, untouched but faintly darker now, as though the crust had aged hours in minutes. He didn't move toward it. Some things were best left alone once the night had taken notice. The wife reached for the candle on the table and drew it closer. Its flame bent sharply toward her, as though caught by an unseen breath. The grandmother's eyes followed it. "If the flame leans toward you," she said, "someone in the house carries worry in their heart." The wife exhaled softly. "Then it knows me well enough." The grandmother nodded. If it bends away, it means peace has already begun to settle. She paused. It's good to see it still move. It means the air listens kindly. The father's gaze shifted toward the window again. Something faint caught his eye. A small glimmer near the fence line. Not bright enough to be a lantern, not steady enough to be a star. It blinked once, then again, as if answering the rhythm of the fire's breath. He rose quietly, crossed to the window, and peered through the gap in the shutter. The frost outside shimmered faintly, catching the weak light of the moon. The glimmer moved once more, slow and uneven, like a hand waving in the fog. Then it was gone. He didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. The old woman's voice came behind him, quiet and even. Don't follow it. He turned slightly. I wasn't going to. I know, she said, but I say it all the same. The girl stirred then, half awake, her voice small. I heard whispering. The wife stroked her hair. Only the wind. The girl shook her head. No, the wind was quiet. It said my name. The grandmother's eyes opened fully now. That's no harm, she said softly. The night repeats what it hears. When we speak near fire or water, it carries the sound. That's why we speak kindly after midnight. The father's expression was uneasy. And if it isn't the night, then it's memory, the grandmother said. A memory can't touch you unless you call it. The fire popped once, sending up a brief spark that died before reaching the chimney. The wife added another log, slow and careful. The flames caught after a moment, flaring gold before settling again. The warmth crept through the room, easing the chill that had gathered in the corners. The grandmother began to murmur, not quite prayer, not quite story, something in between. Her voice carried a steady rhythm, the kind that seemed to match the crackle of the fire. The wife closed her eyes, the words wrapping around her like another blanket. The father listened without admitting that he did. The sound seemed to steady the air. Then came another sign. The candle flame, which had burned straight and tall all evening, suddenly split in two. The wick glowed red at its base, the flame dividing into twin tongues of light that danced apart before rejoining. The grandmother's eyes fixed on it. That's a warning, she said softly. The wife's eyes opened. Of what? Change, the grandmother said. Two paths that cross. One must yield. The father frowned, his voice low. You could make meaning from anything if you stare long enough. The old woman's gaze stayed on the candle. That's true, she said. But meaning finds us whether we believe in it or not. The room fell silent again. Outside, the mist began to move, not forward or back, but in slow spirals, curling like smoke. The frost on the window shimmered faintly, the light from the lantern bending across it in strange refractions. The girl stirred again, whispering something about footsteps. The father turned, but there was nothing. The grandmother's voice came again, quieter now, almost a whisper. You'll hear things that aren't there before dawn. The old ones say it's the world sorting itself. What's meant to stay, stays. What isn't, fades. The wife's eyes stayed on the flame. And how do we know which we are? The grandmother looked toward her, her expression unreadable. We wake. For a long while no one spoke. The house seemed to sway gently with the rhythm of the fire, the shadows pulsing like slow heartbeats along the walls. The wife rested her head against her hand, half in thought, half in exhaustion. The father kept his gaze fixed on the door, his jaw tight. The grandmother watched the candle until its flame steadied again, one light instead of two. Then came another sound, faint, inside the walls. It wasn't knocking this time, more like brushing, as though something passed along the outer boards with care not to be heard. The father froze. The wife's hand found her daughter's shoulder. The grandmother only said, "It's passing." The brushing moved once around the back wall, then stopped. The house went silent again. "They always move before dawn," the grandmother murmured. "When the world's between breaths." The father forced a slow exhale. "They'll move on." "They always do," she said. "But they leave signs to remind us they were real." He didn't ask what kind. He already knew. The wife rose and crossed to the window again, careful not to wake the children. The frost had begun to melt where the warmth reached it, leaving thin trails that dripped down the glass in strange, winding lines. One of them curved sharply near the center, forming what looked almost like the shape of a hand. She stepped back, her throat tightening. "There's a mark," she whispered. The grandmother's voice came calm, steady. "Don't wipe it away." The father looked at her sharply. "Why not?" "It's the last of the night's talk," she said. "When morning comes, it'll vanish on its own." He didn't argue. He couldn't. The air itself seemed too full for words. The wife returned to her seat. The girl had fallen back asleep, her breathing light and even. The boy murmured once and turned over. The grandmother leaned her head back, eyes closing again. "The night of signs," she said softly, "always before the dawn. It warns and it blesses, both in the same breath." The father sat still, listening. Outside, the mist had thinned again. The frost was losing its shine. A faint blue had begun to creep along the horizon, though it was still hours before the sun. The sound that came from the woods now was faint and familiar. The sigh of branches swaying, the slow rhythm of wind through bare limbs. The grandmother opened her eyes just enough to see the light changing. "It's easing," she said. "The night's told what it meant to tell." The wife reached for the candle, shielding it with her hand. The flame stood straight again, calm and steady. The father leaned forward, the tightness in his shoulders finally loosening. "Then we've been heard," he said quietly. The grandmother nodded once, as all who keep the fire are. The wind moved through the chimney with a long, low sound, not mournful this time, but gentle, almost like a sigh of relief. The embers glowed, the frost faded, and the world outside began to shift from silver to pale grey. The signs had passed, leaving only warmth where fear had been. The bread by the door had cooled to hard crust, untouched, but no longer heavy with meaning. The candle's flame burned strong. The grandmother's breathing deepened, steady now, no longer watchful. The father stood and stretched, his joints stiff from sitting. The wife watched the window as the first faint suggestion of light traced the frost's edge. The girl murmured in her sleep. The boy turned over once more. The house settled with a quiet groan, the kind of sound that comes when wood relaxes after holding tight through the cold. The grandmother whispered one last thing before letting sleep take her. "The signs are kind this year," she said. "The land remembers us gently." The wife looked toward the fire, her expression soft. "Then let it keep remembering." And as the last stretch of the night drifted toward the pale promise of dawn, the house remained steady, its light unbroken, the echoes of the dark fading back into the quiet folds of the world, leaving only the warmth of survival and the calm rhythm of breath shared between those still listening for what came next. The last hours of the night always felt the longest. They didn't move the way other hours did. They stretched and folded, looping back on themselves until it was impossible to tell how much time had passed. The fire had burned down again, only a slow pulse of light moving through the ash. The logs had long since become embers, glowing deep red beneath the grey. The house seemed smaller in the half-dark, every wall breathing with the cold that pressed from outside. The father sat nearest the hearth. His eyes were heavy, his posture slumped, but he refused to sleep. The old habit of keeping watch ran too deep. Across from him, the grandmother dozed, her head tilted forward, her hands folded loosely around the spindle she hadn't used in hours. The wife sat beside the children, both wrapped in a single blanket, her hand resting on the girl's shoulder. The boy's face was turned toward the fire, his lips parted in shallow sleep. Outside, the wind had gone. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. It wasn't the same quiet that came with peace. It was the kind that waited. Every few moments, the house creaked softly, the sound of old wood shifting under the cold. The father listened to each noise, counting them like heartbeats. The grandmother stirred. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharp. "Still keeping watch," she murmured. The father gave a small nod. "Till the light." The old woman's voice was rough from sleep. "You'll wear yourself out before it comes. The dark can't be outstared." "Maybe not," he said, "but I can meet it looking." The grandmother leaned back, her gaze settling on the coals. "That's a man's answer," she said softly. "The dark doesn't need your eyes. It needs your patience." The wife looked up from where she sat, her voice low. "It's not much longer now. The air feels different." The grandmother nodded faintly. "The world's turning again. You can always feel it before you see it." The father leaned forward, prodding the coals with the iron poker. The faint hiss of shifting ash filled the room. The glow brightened a little, pushing the shadows back. The fire responded with a quiet sigh. The warmth returned slowly, not enough to chase the cold, but enough to remind them it hadn't gone. The wife whispered, "Do you think the night's finished?" The grandmother's eyes didn't move from the fire. Not finished, just tired. The father sat back again. The sound of the wind didn't return, but every so often a faint noise drifted from outside. The brittle snap of ice along the roof, the soft creak of a branch under frost. It wasn't menacing, just present. The world was still there, breathing slowly beyond the walls. The girl stirred beneath the blanket, her small voice cutting through the stillness. "Is it morning?" "Not yet," her mother whispered. "Soon." The child's eyes opened slightly, unfocused and heavy with dreams. "It feels like the night's watching us." The grandmother smiled faintly. "Then it's learning manners," she said. "We've watched it long enough." The girl's eyes closed again, her breathing settling. The grandmother's voice grew softer, almost like she was speaking to herself. "When I was young, my mother used to say that the longest hour before dawn isn't meant for sleep. It's for remembering. The night listens then, and the living are closest to the ones who remember them." The wife's eyes lifted toward her. "You think they're still here?" The grandmother's head tilted slightly. "Not here, but near. Like voices carried on wind. If you speak softly, they hear. If you sit still, they answer." The father gave a quiet exhale. "Then it's a good thing we've kept the fire burning." The old woman nodded. "Light is what divides us from what waits. You don't fight the dark. You tend the flame and let it hold the line." The wife shifted slightly, pulling the blanket higher around her shoulders. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," the grandmother said. "Hard, but simple. All our keeping, all our praying, all our stories. They're just ways of keeping the light steady till morning." The father's eyes went to the door again. The bread still sat there, the plate rimmed with a thin layer of frost. The lantern beside it had gone out. He rose quietly, lifted the lantern, and brought it back to the table. He relit it with a coal from the hearth. The glass fogged, then cleared. The small light filled the room again, weak but sure. The grandmother watched him. "The fire gives warmth," she said, "but the lantern tells direction. That's why we keep both." He nodded, placing it down beside her chair. The minutes, or what could have been hours, passed slow. The world outside remained pale and unchanging. The frost on the windows was thicker now, opaque in some places, clear in others. Through one small patch, the wife could see the faint outline of the trees against the horizon, motionless and white. She spoke quietly. "Do you ever think it's too quiet?" The grandmother's tone stayed even. "Quiet isn't emptiness. It's just the part of the world that doesn't need noise to live." The father rubbed his hands together, then leaned forward again. "Still, it feels strange, like the world's holding its breath before something." The grandmother's gaze stayed on the fire. "It always does, just before dawn. The earth goes still while it decides whether to let another day begin." The wife looked at her. "And what if it decided not to?" The grandmother smiled faintly. "Then we'd never know." The wife didn't ask more. The old woman's breathing grew deeper. Her voice softened until it was barely a murmur. "In the old country, they used to say that if the rooster crowed before the first light, it meant the dead had been turned away. The night had done its work and was ready to rest. But if the rooster stayed silent, the dawn came slow and grey." The father leaned back. "We haven't kept chickens for years." "Then we listen for the wind," she said. "It does the same thing, only quieter." The room went still again. The father thought he heard something then. A long sigh from outside, low and smooth, moving through the trees. It wasn't loud, just enough to stir the frost along the glass. The grandmother opened her eyes at the same moment. "There," she said. "That's it. The turning." The wife felt it too. A shift so small, she might have missed it if not for the silence that came before. The air no longer felt pressed against the house. It had loosened. The world had taken its first small breath of morning, even if no light had yet touched it. The girl stirred again, this time sitting up slightly. "I dreamed about the fields," she said. The wife brushed her hair back. "What about them?" "They were covered in frost," the girl said. "But it wasn't cold. It looked like glass." The grandmother nodded. "That's a good dream. Means the land's resting. It remembers us kindly." The boy woke then, rubbing his eyes. "Is it morning?" he asked. The father smiled faintly. "Not yet, but close enough." The boy stood, wobbling a little from sleep, and walked to the window. He pressed his hand against the frost. The shape of his palm melted a small circle through it. The cold bit his skin, but he didn't move it. "It's pretty," he said. The grandmother's voice came quiet from behind him. "That's how it starts. The world softens before it wakes." The wife rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. "Then we've made it through," she said softly. The grandmother nodded, though she didn't open her eyes again. "We always do. The night's only ever a visitor." The fire gave a soft crackle, sending a faint warmth across the floor. The father watched the light crawl over the boards, thin as thread. The first faint trace of blue had begun to show along the edges of the frost outside. It wasn't sunlight, not yet. It was the promise of it, the quiet before colour returned. The wife moved to the table, clearing the cups and plates that had sat untouched since the evening. The sound of ceramic against wood felt strange after so much stillness. It broke the silence just enough to remind them the world hadn't stopped. The father looked toward her. "You should rest a bit. The day will come soon enough." She shook her head. "No one sleeps now. It would feel wrong." The grandmother smiled faintly. "She's right. You don't sleep through the first breath of morning. You let it find you awake." The wife poured water into a basin, her movements slow and quiet. She washed her hands, the sound soft but sharp in the still room. The father stirred the fire again, coaxing a little more flame from the embers. The grandmother murmured under her breath, a rhythm without words, half lullaby, half prayer. The boy yawned. The girl rubbed her eyes. The wife leaned down to kiss their heads. "You'll sleep when the light's up," she said. The grandmother's voice came again, steady and certain. "Let them rest when the sun's strong enough to fill the corners. Till then, the shadows still belong to the night." The father turned his gaze toward the window one last time. The horizon was changing, almost imperceptibly. The black of the forest had softened to grey. The air carried a hint of colour, not warm but alive. The world was shifting. The grandmother's breathing slowed again, her words a whisper now. "This is the long watch, the hour when the living wait and the dead withdraw. It's the moment between being remembered and being forgotten." The wife reached for her hand, warm and dry. "And which are we?" she asked softly. The old woman smiled without opening her eyes. "Both," she said. "Always both." The house grew quiet again. The fire burned low but steady. The frost on the windows began to thin. The boy and girl drifted back towards sleep, the wife sitting between them, the father keeping his eyes on the soft light gathering outside. The grandmother's voice came once more, barely audible. "You'll hear the first bird soon. When you do, don't speak right away. Let the sound carry through the house first. It wakes the walls before the words can." The father nodded, though she couldn't see him. And then they waited. No one spoke. No one moved. The house stood suspended between dark and light, between silence and sound. The first faint breeze touched the chimney, a soft breath that stirred the ashes. The world exhaled. The grandmother's eyes opened just enough to see the grey at the window. "There," she said softly. "It's begun." And though the light had not yet broken the line of the trees, the warmth in the air had changed. The night was ending, not abruptly, but the way all things end, by remembering to fade. The living sat together in that quiet moment, their fire still glowing, their breath visible in the dim air, each heartbeat carrying them closer to the world's next beginning. The old woman leaned her head back, her expression peaceful. "The hardest part of any night," she murmured, "is believing the dawn will come." The father looked toward the window again, where the faintest hint of colour was creeping over the frost. "But it always does," he said. The grandmother smiled, her voice almost gone. "That's why we keep watch." The coals shifted once more, sending up a final flicker of orange light that brushed across their faces. The sound of a bird's first cry broke the silence outside. It was thin, lonely, and beautiful. No one spoke. The walls listened. The fire answered. The long watch was over. The light came slowly, like a memory trying to return. It didn't spill or break. It crept, soft and colourless at first, until the dark began to loosen its hold on the room. The frost on the windows turned from white to grey, then to faint streaks of silver. Each breath of air inside the house felt different now, cooler, cleaner, touched by the first threads of morning. The father sat where he had been all night, his eyes fixed on the dim outline of the window. He had lost track of the hours somewhere after the last sound of the wind. The grandmother was awake but still, her hands resting on the spindle in her lap. The wife stirred the ashes in the hearth, feeding what was left of the fire with thin pieces of kindling. The flames caught reluctantly, their colour pale and uncertain. The children were still asleep, their faces calm, their breaths shallow but even. The grandmother looked toward the window. "There it is," she said. Her voice was dry, almost brittle. "The light never rushes. It waits until the world's ready to believe in it again." The wife glanced over her shoulder, then turned back to the hearth. The small flames flickered and steadied. The scent of wood smoke filled the air, warm and grounding. She added one more stick and sat back, rubbing her hands together. "It feels strange," she said quietly, "like everything's still listening, even now." The grandmother nodded slowly. "It is. The dawn doesn't silence the night. It carries what it heard into the day. That's why mornings are quiet. The world's still remembering what it learned while we slept." The father rose, his joints stiff, and crossed to the window. He rubbed a circle clear in the frost with his sleeve. Outside, the fields stretched pale and flat beneath the faint blue of early light. The mist had vanished completely, leaving behind the sheen of ice across the grass and the low fence lines. The forest beyond stood black and bare, its edges softened by the thin glow that hovered at the horizon. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog the glass again. "The frost is heavy," he said. The grandmother replied without opening her eyes. "That's good. It means the night's been satisfied." The wife turned from the fire. "Satisfied with what?" "With the living," she said. "It's the way of things. The frost takes what the dark can't keep." The father didn't ask what she meant. He had learned that the old woman's words made more sense when left alone. He stood a moment longer at the window, then turned back to the table. The lantern still burned beside it, its flame weak but steady. He reached out and turned down the wick until it went out. The smell of warm oil lingered briefly in the air. The wife poured water from the jug into a small cup and offered it to him. He drank, then passed it back. The water was cold enough to sting his throat, but it cleared the heaviness from his chest. The grandmother's gaze had drifted toward the fire again. "You should eat," she said softly. "It's unkind to greet the morning hungry." The wife smiled faintly. "It feels too early for food." "Morning always comes before hunger's ready," the old woman said. The wife tore a piece of bread from what was left of the loaf and handed it to her. The grandmother took it, her hands shaking slightly. She held it near the fire for a moment, warming it before eating. The father joined her, taking a small piece for himself. The sound of chewing was faint, but solid in the quiet room, a reminder of the world returning to itself. The boy stirred first, stretching beneath the blanket. His eyes opened halfway, squinting against the light. "It's morning," he said, more as fact than discovery. The girl turned over, her hair tangled across her face. "Did the night go?" The grandmother smiled. "It went the way all nights do. It left us to the light." The boy sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Were there ghosts?" The old woman looked at him gently. "Only memories. They don't linger once the sun remembers their names." The wife brushed the frost from the sill. The faintest gold had begun to rise beyond the trees, a thin edge of warmth that spread across the fields in slow waves. The colour reached the window, touched the frost, and melted a small patch in the corner. A drop of water slid down the glass, leaving a clean trail behind it. The grandmother watched. "There," she murmured. "That's the world forgiving itself." The father turned to her. "You always speak as if the night is alive." She smiled faintly. "It is. Everything that waits is alive. Even silence breathes if you listen long enough." He nodded, not as agreement, but acknowledgement. He had come to understand that belief wasn't required for truth to exist. Some things simply were. The wife crossed to the door and lifted the latch. The wood creaked softly as she pulled it open. Cold air poured in, sharp and clean, carrying the smell of frost and damp earth. The horizon had brightened, streaked now with pale yellow and a hint of pink. The field shimmered under the light, each blade of grass lined with ice that caught and threw back colour. The father joined her at the doorway. Neither spoke. The quiet wasn't emptiness now. It was peace, a space the night had left behind for them to fill. The grandmother's voice carried softly from behind. "The first light is never loud. It doesn't need to be. The dark knows when to bow to it." The wife stepped aside to let the morning in. The air filled the room, crisp and new. The firelight faded beneath the stronger glow from outside. The children sat up fully now, watching the changing colour of the world with wide eyes. The grandmother leaned forward in her chair. "Now," she said, "we give thanks." The father turned. "For what?" "For still being here to see it." He nodded once, a simple motion that held more weight than words could. The wife closed the door gently, leaving a narrow line of light along the floor. The grandmother's voice steadied. "When I was a girl, we used to greet the dawn with water. We'd wash our hands in the frost and touch the earth before speaking. It reminded us we were part of the same turning." The wife looked toward the basin. "We can do that." She poured what little water was left into it. The father dipped his hands first, the chill biting into his skin. He rubbed them together, then pressed his palms against the table's edge, leaving faint, wet prints behind. The wife followed, then the children, each flinching at the cold but smiling after. The grandmother dipped her fingers last, then touched them lightly to the hearthstones. "There," she whispered. "The night knows we're thankful." The fire popped once, as if answering her. The smell of smoke and damp ash rose again, blending with the clean scent of morning air. The light had grown stronger now, pale gold filling the corners of the room that had stayed hidden for hours. Dust motes drifted through it like tiny embers. The boy stood at the window, watching the frost melt. "It looks different," he said. The grandmother nodded. "It always does, after a night that listens." The wife began to clear the table. The father gathered the wood beside the hearth. The grandmother rested her hands in her lap, her eyes half closed, the faintest smile on her face. Outside, the world was waking. A crow called from somewhere beyond the trees, its voice sharp against the soft air. The frost on the ground was already thinning where the light touched it, leaving dark patches of earth exposed. The mist that had haunted the fields was gone, leaving behind only a faint shimmer where it had been. The grandmother spoke again, her tone quiet but sure. "The old country used to say the first light was a promise, not of joy, not of peace, just of continuation. It meant the world hadn't forgotten to begin again." The wife looked toward her. "And that's enough?" The old woman nodded. "It's everything. Most of living is just remembering to start over." The father stepped outside for a moment, the cold air biting his face. He looked across the field toward the line of trees. The sky had opened fully now, streaked with gold and grey. The shapes of the land were clear again, the fence, the barn, the long stretch of ground where the frost still clung. It all looked untouched, as if the night had never come. But he knew better. The stillness carried memory. He closed his eyes, listening. There was no wind, no movement, only the soft hum of the earth under frost. Then, from somewhere beyond the forest, came the faintest sound, the trickle of a stream thawing, water finding its voice again after being silent through the night. He turned back toward the house. The door stood open just enough for light to spill across the threshold. He stepped inside and shut it gently behind him. The grandmother's eyes followed him. "It's done," she said. "The night's gone to rest." The father looked at her. "Till next year." She smiled. "Till always. The dark doesn't end. It only moves." The wife set a pot on the hearth, the sound of iron against stone grounding the room again. The children sat close to the fire, their voices soft but full of life. The father took his seat at the table, his hands finally steady. The grandmother leaned back, her eyes drifting closed, the faint rhythm of breath marking her peace. The light through the window had turned gold now, warm enough to touch the walls. The frost was gone. The mist had lifted. The air smelled of wood smoke, fresh water, and earth. The long night had loosened its grip, leaving only the small, ordinary signs of morning. The father reached across the table and took his wife's hand. Neither spoke. The old woman's voice came once more, soft as the rustle of cloth. "This is how the world begins again," she said, quietly, without asking. The wife squeezed his hand. The children laughed softly near the fire. The house seemed larger now, the walls no longer pressing close. Outside, the frost melted into small rivulets that ran toward the ditch, shining like thin silver threads in the new light. A breeze stirred through the fields, carrying with it the smell of thawing soil and distant pine. The forest, silent for hours, answered with the faint rustle of branches waking. The grandmother's words lingered, gentle and certain. "Every dawn is an answer, even if we've forgotten the question." The father looked toward the window, where the sunlight had grown bright enough to touch the table. The room glowed softly, the last traces of night fading from its corners. He exhaled slowly, the sound of it joining the breath of the house, the rhythm of the waking world. The grandmother opened her eyes one last time and smiled faintly. "There," she whispered. "We've made it through." The wife nodded, her voice low. "And we'll do it again." The grandmother's eyes closed. "Always," she murmured. "That's the promise." The fire gave one final pop, a small burst of light against the growing day. The warmth spread through the room, steady and alive. The world outside gleamed with colour now, the frost gone, the fields open, the first birds circling the pale sky. The house stood small but certain, its walls holding the faint scent of smoke and the quiet memory of the night that had passed. And as the first full light of morning filled every corner, the living sat within it, their hearts steady, their breaths even, their fire still burning, keeping faith with the night that had gone and the day that had begun, both belonging to the same endless turning of the world.